for those in the audience who may be wondering how an author shifts his book subjects from baseball history to presidential history, I'll tell you how by tweaking a line from country singer Colin Ray. Here's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Now, most people's passion for a particular field begins in childhood, and that was certainly true in my case. It was the summer of 1960, and I just finished kindergarten. And thanks to my older sister, I had fallen in love with reading, and as you know, when you're 6 years old, your brain is a sponge for everything that it reads. Now, living in Houston that summer, I had a friend across the street who introduced me to the wonderful world of baseball cards. And because of my sponge brain, I started absorbing all the information on the back of the cards, and my mother got scared. All those good brain cells in her young boy's mind were going to waste because they were being filled up entirely with baseball statistics. How could she get her son to broaden his horizons? When the summer ended and the first grade began, right before my 7th birthday on October 1, 1960, my mother found the solution to her problem at the bookstore. Bingo! Trading cards about the presidents of the United States. Just like baseball cards with pictures on the front and information on the back. Perfectly ripe for a sponge-brained first grader to absorb, and boy, did I ever devour those cards. That gave me 2 passions at age 7, baseball and the presidency. And if I didn't make it to the big leagues as a ball player when I grew up, well then for plan B, I would just have to become president of the United States. Either way, I'd be on a trading card. Now let me tell you, there's nothing more affirming for a young boy than for his first grade teacher to say that he's a genius. Now, obviously, I was not a genius, but she thought I was because I could recite all the presidents in order and knew something about each of them, even Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, that's how my story about my love for presidential history and baseball came from each other. It was all in the cards. And for more than half a century, those passions have stayed with me and have grown, especially since, besides trading cards, there's another connection between baseball and the presidency. Yes, it happens every spring. The President of the United States throws out the first pitch and the baseball season begins. Now, something else happened during those grade school years that directed my future in general and my career path in particular. As I learned more about presidents from books than was on the back of the cards, one of the things I learned was what they had done for a living before they became president. And lo and behold, a huge percent of them had been lawyers. When I turned 7, Eisenhower was finishing his 2nd term, and out of our first 33 presidents, exactly 2/3 of them were lawyers. So as I was considering the idea of one day becoming president of the United States, it sure looked like my chances would be greatly increased if I spent the first part of my career as a lawyer. So I soon learned that our greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, had been a terrific trial lawyer. And so as I locked in on learning about trial lawyer turned President Lincoln, my parents were locking in every week on a TV show that soon got my attention. Perry Mason, the super lawyer who always won his trials by asking the killer questions that devastated the final witness at the end of every episode. Then another big presence entered my psyche as I thought about pursuing the law on the road to the presidency. Gregory Peck played lawyer Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird that came out in late 1962 and became the greatest hero ever portrayed in a movie, according to the American Film Institute poll. And Atticus was a hero because he was the master of the courtroom in how he defended Tom Robinson and asked his zinger questions and proved Robinson's innocence by tearing apart poor little stupid Mayella Ewell. He was so effective and worked with such dignity that all the African Americans in Macomb, Alabama, who had watched the Robinson trial from the balcony rose up in tribute when he left the courtroom after the trial ended. That looked pretty good to me. So, after learning that Abraham Lincoln had mastered the courtroom before he became president, and seeing Perry Mason master the courtroom on television with his zinger questions, and Atticus Finch master the courtroom with his zinger questions at the movies, what else could I do when I grew up? I had to be a lawyer who asked zinger questions in courtrooms. So off I went, starting in grade school, aiming first for a career as a trial lawyer, which, if I played my cards right, might one day lead to the White House. With that goal, I started seizing every opportunity to develop my interrogation skills. That meant joining the junior high and then the high school debate teams, where I specialized in cross-ex debates, breaking down my opponents with my zinger questions. Then came University of Texas student politics, where there was lots of interrogation and advocacy. After college came UT Law School, where I competed in moot court and mock trial competitions. Then after graduation, I began doing trial work here in Dallas and had some success. But unlike Perry Mason and Atticus Finch, my trials weren't on television or in the movies. The only people who saw them were those people involved in my cases, and they were mainly in remote courtrooms. So 6 years ago, I got the chance to use my interrogating skills outside the law, doing on-stage interviews of big-time authors and public figures who came to town to speak at programs sponsored by the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. My first big one was Michael Lewis. When he came in 2010 on the national tour of his book, The Big Short, about the 2008 financial collapse. Because Mr. Lewis has such a following, the interview took place on the stage of the Fairmont Hotel's largest ballroom in front of a sold-out crowd. And when it was over, Michael stopped and looked at me and said, "You know, Talmage, of all my interviews on this book tour, you were tougher on me about what Goldman Sachs did than anybody else." 1 week after the program, the SEC sued Goldman Sachs. Affirmation is good for the soul. My next big interview came with Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David McCulloch on the tour of his book, The Greater Journey, about Americans before and after the year 1800 who left home and moved to Paris to develop expertise in their chosen fields. For my third question, I asked David about the way the artist Samuel Morse had made choices when he painted, about what he had painted in his masterpiece, Gallery of the Louvre, which David had thoroughly covered in the book, and to compare Morse's approach to picking his subjects to the way David had made his selections about the people he chose to profile in his chapters. After hearing that question, David paused, and it was a pregnant pause. I didn't know what was going on. And then in front of the crowd, he asked, "Talmage, what do you do for a living?" He said, "You've asked me something about my book that I've never even thought about." Well, David McCulloch's response went way beyond mere affirmation. It lifted me to a state of bliss. And when bliss comes, we should all abide in the words of Joseph Campbell. Follow your bliss. Find where it is. Don't be afraid to follow it. My next big interview was with another Pulitzer Prize winning historian, John Meacham, who came to town 3.5 years ago promoting his biography of Thomas Jefferson. At mid-interview, I asked John the following hypothetical question. John, we're now in the second decade of the 21st century, and let's assume the Jefferson Memorial had never been built. Now let's also assume that this year a congressman introduces a bill that seeks to have federal funds used for the building of a new Jefferson Memorial. Knowing everything we now know about what Jefferson did with his slaves at Monticello, would a bill to fund a new Jefferson Memorial get passed by Congress if it came to a vote this year? After I finished the question, just like David McCulloch, John Meacham paused, then smiled and answered, no, that bill wouldn't pass. Given the slavery issue, today's Congress would not vote to approve a Jefferson Memorial. And when the program ended, John said, you know what? That's the best question anybody asked on my national tour. So after the Meacham interview, on the heels of the McCulloch and the Lewis programs, I began thinking, not only is this interviewing bringing moments of bliss into my life, it might turn into something. Maybe I should start recording the interviews and getting my secretary to transcribe them. And then I would have a permanent record of what people said. So in the next couple of years, I did that. I did onstage interviews and recorded and had them transcribed with Henry Kissinger, Pulitzer Prize winner Scott Berg, filmmaker Ken Burns, best-selling historians Michael Duffy and Douglas Brinkley. And those I interviewed seemed to like doing the programs. Scott Berg even thanked me for being Fred Astaire to his Ginger Rogers. And the audience seemed to like the programs. And I really liked doing them because I was getting to be Perry Mason on stage, asking zinger questions in front of crowds, not in remote, empty courtrooms. So that's where things were as of February 2015, a year and a half ago, when one day I picked up a magical book, Essentialism, by Greg McKeown, the theme of which is to identify the one big thing in your life that you see as your life's calling and that fully utilizes your talents and passions. And once you've found it, pursue it and block out all distractions that stand in the way of achieving your goal. Essentialism made me stop and think about where I was in life, what my skills and passions were that could be applied to a one big thing project. I was an experienced trial lawyer who was enjoying opportunities more and more to do onstage interviews and becoming more fascinated with my childhood passion of presidential history, since my passion for writing baseball history had waned after my Baseball and the Baby Boomer did not exactly become a New York Times bestseller. So after reading Essentialism and thinking about one big thing that I could shoot for in my life going forward, I had a light bulb epiphany in February 2015 and seized on what to do with my non-billable hour, non-sleeping, non-eating time in the future that could be my one big thing. And what I committed to was to be a proactive force for the study, discussion, and advancement of presidential history by first reading the best biographies of our commanders-in-chief, then lining up interviews with the authors, then asking them my most penetrating questions that would require them to go beyond their books in onstage conversations that would be preserved in transcript, and then compiled into a book of fully loaded presidential history. And to me, doing that should be valuable to American history lovers by giving readers the opportunities to get the juiciest nuggets of information about our most significant presidents, gathered from some of our top Oval Office experts, and all the insightful nuggets would be there for the reader's perusal and reflection in one book. So it was all those circumstances: childhood trading cards, watching Perry Mason and Atticus Finch, developing cross-ex skills as a high school debater, working almost 40 years as a lawyer, discovering the bliss of on-stage interviewing that put me on the cutting edge of historical analysis while engaging in conversations with presidential history's top minds, and finally connecting with the book Essentialism. All these formative experiences of my life came together as I set out to pursue my one big thing a year and a half ago that's become my new book, Cross-Examining History: A Lawyer Gets Answers from the Experts About Our Presidents. Experts. Who are the experts about our presidents? They come in two groups. First group, presidential biographers, those who have spent years researching and producing books with deep insights and spellbinding narrative arcs, all supported with hundreds of footnotes that tell the best stories in the most artful ways about the top leaders in our country's history. People like Emmy Award winner Ken Burns, Pulitzer Prize winners David McCulloch, John Meacham, and David Maraniss, Pulitzer Prize finalists Gene Edward Smith and H.W. Brands, and best-selling presidential biographers Evan Thomas, Douglas Brinkley, Michael Duffy, Ronald White, Amity Shlaes, and Harold Holzer. Second group of Oval Office experts, presidential insiders, those who have spent countless hours working with our commanders-in-chief. People like Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor and Secretary of State to Presidents Nixon and Ford. James Baker, White House Chief of Staff and Secretary of the Treasury to President Reagan and Secretary of State to President George H.W. Bush. Lyndon Johnson Robb, LBJ's daughter, and Larry Temple, LBJ's White House counsel. John Sununu, White House Chief of Staff to President Bush 41. And Andy Card, White House Chief of Staff to President Bush 43. Now those were the experts from whom I would seek the answers to my Perry Mason questions, aimed at moving history's gray areas toward the direction of black and white clarity, and finding out the closest thing to the truth that we can find from today's top experts about our most significant presidents. That was the goal. Good idea. But how could I execute on my one big thing and line up interviews with all those experts on a fairly quick timetable? From the beginning, I had reason to think I could pull it off. I knew I already had a head start on the project since I'd completed transcript with prior interviews of Henry Kissinger and Ken Burns and 6 others. And I knew I had a signed contract to do an interview in November 2015 with David McCulloch, author of biographies on John Adams and Harry Truman. I also knew it didn't make sense to interview a historian about every American president, because doing that would make the book too thick. And besides, who wants to know more about Millard Fillmore and Benjamin Harrison? So I selected who I believed to be the 21 most significant presidents, and then identified a leading biographer of each of them, and also identified the White House insiders who I had access to, and then came up with a strategy for scheduling an on-stage interview event with each of them. And with that plan in place, I moved forward in an execution mode on my February 2015 Epiphany, and amazingly, all kinds of good things fell into place and allowed me to pull off 23 interviews in the next 10 months. Now, maybe the good things fell into place because I was lucky. Though Seneca said, luck is the intersection of preparation and opportunity. Maybe it was more than luck. Maybe good things happened because of synchronicity, Carl Jung's term for a meaningful coincidence of two or more events where something other than the possibility of chance is involved, as if one is being helped along by hidden hands. Whether it was luck or whether it was synchronicity, here are the circumstances that allowed me to complete